everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action podcast. I am very excited today to welcome Karen Pando-Mars. Karen is a licensed MFT, was a founder of the Sandtray Network and a contributing editor of its journal. As adjunct faculty at Dominican University in San Rafael, California, she taught accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy as the overarching theoretical model in the Alternative and Innovative Psychotherapies course. She is currently senior faculty at the AEDP Institute and has a clinical and consultation practice in San Anselmo, California. Hi, everybody. Hi to all of our listeners of Attachment Theory in Action podcast. I am so very excited to have you joining us today, Karen. You are all the way in California, is that correct?
California, yep.
And hopefully the sun is shining for you today.
Beautiful out. I can see through my window. It's great.
Oh, wonderful. Well, funnily enough, I'm in the Midwest and today we also have sunshine. Doesn't always happen this time of year, but today we do. So thank you so much for joining us. As always, I love to start the podcast by asking my guests whether anything in their early life or early career sometimes has led them into the path or the journey that they've been on in the attachment field. And so we're going to be talking about your new book that's coming out, Tailoring Treatment to Attachment Patterns. And so I know that your work has been very in-depth. Share with our listeners what took you down this path into the field of attachment.
Okay. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And
you are welcome.
So looking forward to our conversation. So I was thinking about I think one of the first things that really led me into psychotherapy and attachment is when I was a young teenager, 14. My mom had a really bad accident and I witnessed it. She almost died. My first thought was, her mother died when she was 14. My mother's going to die when I was 14. And it was just this immediate sense that history repeats itself. And then, unfortunately, or how it just went, was I was very untended. My mother's in the hospital in a semi-coma. She was actually in there for 2 weeks. And no one really asked me about my experience, what I saw. And I was quite alone and never unpacked that, but started gaining weight, started just being a little more distant, and poems started coming to me in the night. So it was this interesting thing that while I was starting to sort of be not so present, poems came that I didn't understand when they were happening, but later in my life, I was able to trace. They actually showed me how I was burying my pain and fear inside and then stepping outside to just deal, or falling into a hole hoping that one day I would be found. And so it gave me, when I thought about it later in my life, I had such a sense that there's this inner guidance system that knew where I was even when I was lost to myself. So that's one thing that was really important. And then after college, I majored in Spanish. I have family from South America, from Peru, and I was in Peru really trying to kind of decide my next steps. Do I want to live here, learn Spanish, become bilingual fully, or do I want to go back to the States? And I ended up with this question of really wanting to know what motivates people beneath culture. And I ended up coming back to the States and realizing, I want to study psychology. That's it. And then the cool thing, and I'll just end with this, is that as I became a therapist, I went to the Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, which had a lovely East-West philosophy and Western psychology. And but it wasn't until I met Diana Fosha and AEDP in 2005 that I learned about attachment. I had gone to school sort of before the 90s, before everything came into the 90s of attachment theory and neuroscience and all that. So I had these questions, and when I met AEDP, I realized, oh, attachment, emotion. Somewhere along the line, I got these are the motivational forces underneath all culture, universal. So
Mhm.
that was really when I started getting excited about attachment and brain science and just sort of what ended up leading to the book.
So you've had got some personal experience and then some professional experience that has led you down this path onto a deeper understanding of attachment. And I think what's very interesting in our world at Chaddock and the work that we do, our focus is on developmental trauma and attachment. And when I hear you describe your experience of your mother's, her own traumatic experience, it really makes me think about how trauma can play such a big part, and that it wasn't that your trauma itself was at the hands of your caregiver, which often can be the case when we're talking about attachment and trauma, but it was more that you were left alone with the trauma, that you didn't have somebody or a secure base with which to explore that trauma, to process what was happening. And I think that often gets lost. Many people are either attachment focused or they're trauma focused and not really looking at this complex interaction between the both.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that AEDP formulates is that it's being alone with unwilled and unwanted overwhelming experience. That's the seed of psychopathology. And so my experience really fits that. I also think that not being talked to about what happened kind of indicates that there were certain areas of experience that were left out of childhood, like really understanding and dealing with emotions and experiences close to the self. That
Would you say, and this is definitely a deeper personal question, would you say that did you experience any of that prior to your mom's near-death experience? Like, do you feel that there was some missing emotional responsiveness in your early caregiving relationships?
I think things looked good on the outside, but on the inside, they didn't feel so good. I think, I grew up middle class, kind of had what I needed, so to speak. But when it really came to dealing with difficulties and troubles, no one really talked to us. I have two brothers. We weren't talked to. And my parents also had a really challenging relationship. So there was a lot of um, their relationship wasn't solid. They didn't create a secure base for us. I saw the fractures in their relationship. So I remember being a kid and being like, no, I don't want to be treated like that. Or I felt this sort of just um, lack of love between them, which translated. I think they did their best to love us and give us so much. But when parents' relationships are burdened and troubled, it carries over. And so I know that was a factor.
Well, and I think we in the field have a luxury in that we have more of an understanding of this. And I think many people who aren't in the field, who have maybe experienced something similar to what you've described, they come to learn it as just normal. Like this is what family and connection between caregiver and child is like, and it's normal. And then they enter into adult relationships, perhaps with somebody who has a slightly more of a secure attachment style, and then there's all of these challenges that come up for them because they don't have the understanding that actually when we miss some of that responsiveness from our caregivers, that is those are important steps for healthy social emotional development, and we're missing those steps. And so then we end up having insecurely attached adults then raising insecurely attached children, and this cycle goes on because that awareness isn't there. At least for us in the field, we're able to stand back and say, something doesn't feel right here, like you did. And you get into this field to learn more and figure out, okay, how can I do this differently? And it's not that, certainly not pointing fingers at parents and at caregivers. You do what you can with what you know until you know something different. And so, yes, and I mean, I grew up in England, and I think most people, when they think about English people, the stereotype is that we don't talk about our feelings. We don't get all emotional about things. And so that's just how it is. And like I said, until you know different, you can't do any different. You just do the best that you can. So I really appreciate you sharing some of your own personal story. This is vulnerable work that we do in this attachment field. And so I appreciate you being vulnerable with me and with our listeners. You've mentioned the acronym AEDP a couple of times. Can you clarify for our listeners what the acronym means, and maybe some of how you mentioned Diana Fosha and some of her work? Just tell us a bit more about it.
Sure. But one of the things is Diana Fosha is the developer of AEDP, and she's also co-author of the book. So this is sort of a project that grew through my work in one of the courses, which I'll tell you in a little bit. And then it ended up working out that Diana was very involved in helping me sort of elaborate. And so, but her AEDP originally stands for Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. And over the last few years, it's just become really clear that those 4 words don't capture the essence of what AEDP is. It's based on emotion, based on relationship and transformation. And it's really a modality that explores how people change and what changes. And so it's transdiagnostic, meaning it can work with folks with depression, with attachment wounding, with negative thinking, with experiential avoidance. There's a number of factors that there's research going on now, and the research actually shows that not only do people change, but they get better over time. So it's a 16-session model of treatment that's very promising in terms of what it shows, how this works. But one of the things to say about AEDP is there's a map of change that was articulated really looking at the phenomenology through 4 states. So looking at when folks come in to treatment, there's usually some kind of depression, anxiety. But there's also what Diana coined this word transformance for, like motivation to grow and to change that's inherent in all individuals. So at the same time, while folks come in with suffering, we're also looking for their resilience, their capacities to grow, their capacity and motivational strivings to heal. And that's a strong guiding part in treatment, so that as opposed to looking at resistance, we're looking at transformance and mobilizing change.
I love that, because our clients come to us, and I'll use your word, in a place of suffering and pain. And I think that therapy can often be perceived as a place where we go to deal with our problems, which, okay, it is. But sometimes it becomes very almost negatively focused on the problem and not on where are your strengths through all of this. Where can we find your strengths? And I mean, even just the movement in terms of going from using the words insecure attachment style to adaptive attachment style, and seeing this as you've developed these, your brain, your body developed these skills and behaviors to adapt to the demands of the environment around you. And so really you've survived. You're a survivor of this. And rather than viewing our mental health concerns as maladaptive and problems, seeing them as survival skills and ways that you have adapted, I think is a wonderful approach. And so to hear that, looking for strengths, looking for how we can help you transform with this approach, really, that makes my heart happy to hear that.
I'm glad. One of the things that we do is when, many modalities really help people process trauma and have different ways of processing emotional experiences. And AEDP looks at emotional experiences, relational experiences, self experiences, and processing those. And once people start to have shifts, we use a term called meta-processing, processing those shifts, which actually has led into the realization that when people change and go through changes, there's actually a phenomenology of transformational affects. For instance, oh, I got through that. There's pride. Or there can be a mourning of the self, like, oh, what I know now and I didn't know then, and grieving for the emotional pain of the past. There can be healing affects, feeling moved, feeling grateful to the therapist. There can be realization, like really putting, like, aha, like getting together. Oh, the self wasn't broken. The self was hurt and can be recovered and healed and whole. There's enlivening affect. So there's a series of about 6 to 7 transformational affects that a lot of processes naturally evolve into when this questioning and being with the process is explored. It's very experiential, I have to say.
I love that. It makes, to me, it feels like if I was a client and going through this process, that it's actually just deepening. Yeah, use the word experiential. It's deepening it for me, because I'm not just going from talking about the hard stuff to the good stuff, but I'm recognizing that I'm going through, again, to use your words, this transformation. And there's something so valuable in recognizing my ability to transform from the hard place to the good place. And so I think that just to imagine the value that holds for a client, and also it shifts the empowerment isn't quite the right word I'm looking for, but it shifts the focus from it's the therapist who's doing the healing work to the client who's doing the healing work. Like, this isn't about my journey with you as a therapist and your healing process. This is about your journey and you transforming. And I'm just here to help support and make sure you stay on the right path. Does that make sense?
It does, but I would just say it a little differently than what you say,
please do.
because the subtitle of our book is Healing Trauma in Relationship. That one of the really important parts of AEDP is undoing aloneness, to accompany and recalling that earlier definition of being alone with unwilled and unwanted experience, unbearable experience. It's really, how do we share and bear so that we take on, the attachment part of AEDP, and the relational part is that we, become an attachment figure. We will be stronger, wiser, other. That sense of, not that I have to be older and wiser, but that I can be a guide. So now, to your point, like, yes, there's this guiding. And so at times I'm leading, and then at other times I'm following and helping the unfolding. And so it's like, I don't want to impose and interpret. I want to allow and explore so that the self can emerge. There's the state 4 is core state. And there's this sense that we all have this core self that has this innate wisdom knowing. Core state can be when there's declarative truth, like, oh, now I get what happened to me. I'm not bad. Bad things happened. Oh, and bad things happen to, like, I see the lineage of trauma passed down through the generations, and I can really start to put together the autobiographical narrative that's more coherent and cohesive. Um,
Mm.
so it's really cool to kind of have this map of these four states that don't happen all the time linearly, but by knowing where we are in those states, we really can um, kind of apply interventions to kind of fit what we're looking
Mhm.
at and dealing with.
Karen, I really appreciate your clarification. And I can 100% understand now where what you mean and how we are as a therapist, that secure base for the client in our care. I think actually my misexplanation in a way highlights a little bit the maybe the change that the field has undergone in terms of the therapist's role and position and the part that they play in therapy, and how it used to be very kind of standoffish and no, we're just here to help you process. We're not really going to get into a more of a deeper relationship. But now we're moving, especially, well, in the attachment field at least, we're moving to a different way of being with the client.
Mm-hmm.
Would
Yeah.
you say, go ahead.
Well, no, you're making me think of Mary Ainsworth and this sensitivity and responsiveness. And she really studied the mother's way of being with her child. So I was just sort of triggered to think of her and just her studies with not only the strange situation, which most people know about, the Baltimore studies, though, of the in-home observations. And she developed this mother-infant caregiving scale and actually broke down caregiving and sensitivity and responsiveness into these four categories that just really gets into some of the nitty gritty. And I write about that in the book, but just to share that with folks, because I think her way of, even identifying sensitivity is being aware of a baby signal, having an accurate response to it and a prompt response, just these ways that what is responsiveness? So I'll leave it at that. But that's
well, and my mind is thinking about, how does this look and feel when you're working with an adult versus a child? Most of our work is with children and then the family, but the relationship is the client. And, I'll speak from my personal experience that for me, it comes much easier to be a secure base for a child versus that secure base for an adult. And so it just makes me think about all those nuances that come into play, and how do we do that for adults in a way that feels good for everyone in the room? Again, because often when we think of attachment, we go to the child first and foremost, because it begins in the childhood world. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
I actually do. It kind of leads into how I got into this project of writing about tailoring treatment to attachment patterns.
I want to hold this up for those who are watching. This is Karen's new book that's coming out soon. Do you have March 11th? Is that still our release date?
March 11th is the date, is the delivery date.
Yes, tell us more.
Well, I was teaching an AEDP course, and we have the experiential course. The level 1 has 5 modules. The second module is attachment. So as I was teaching about attachment, one of the students in the class said, well, what do you do when people have different attachment styles? Which in a way is what your question is. When attachment comes into the adult-adult relationship, there can be challenges when people present different patterns, different behaviors. And so what I ended up doing was literally going back to the drawing board, and I drew lines down and lines across the page, and I put the different then styles, now patterns on top: avoidant, ambivalent, resistant, disorganized, secure. And then I just started to look at, like, what am I seeing with different people that would kind of go under these different categories. And I looked at affect regulation. I looked at arousal, attachment system arousal. I looked at self-other patterning, the difference of folks who come in and just want, like, why won't he do that? Why won't she do this? Really focused on the other versus the clients who are focused on being more self-reliant. So I started just kind of looking at how this broke down, how the configuration of each pattern broke down. And that ended up becoming the centerpiece of the book, these grids for secure attachment, insecure attachment. And then the third grid is what we can do, interventions that correspond to each of the rows. So,
which I absolutely love. I mean, I've got my bookmark in the chapter on the grids, and it's hard for me to explain it via the video or on the podcast, but all I can say is to our listeners that you need to go and buy this book, because the grids really, I want to say simplify, but it's not simplifying. It's laying out. Again, you use the word, like, what am I seeing in front of me? How is this really showing up? Very easily for us, I think, both as a clinician, but also to be able to share with our clients, like, here's what's showing up for you. Here is what it looks like in very easy, accessible, an easy and accessible format for you to then take and say, oh, that makes sense. And now, you've mentioned your third grid of what do we do? What are the next steps? What's the action steps? Taking something that is very conceptual and deeply scientific and making it accessible for our clients.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think about, I'm just thinking, for example, I started to really understand that with avoidant patterning, the strategies are a deactivating of the attachment system, whereas the ambivalent resistant pattern, hyperactivating of the attachment system. So that's how we can start to get to understand. I also put in the caregiver hallmarks, the caregiver's state of mind, and the behavioral characteristics. And so to start to create a picture of, not only on those grids is it like, what are the behaviors showing, but what was the early caregiving experience that led to these behaviors? Because that actually translates into something of the therapist's stance. In the third grid, I look at how the therapist might have reactivities that are common to the different patterns. So if I have somebody pushing and dismissing, I might feel inadequate or something's off, or I might go into my head to try to really explain. And if I understand that avoidant behavior comes from early experiences of being dismissed, being rejected, or intruded upon, then I can recognize that what's needed is actually my acceptance, respect, kindness. And so when I look at the grid 6, there's a therapist common reactivities and then therapist meta skills. Like, what are the intentional sensitivities that I can call upon to help me, maybe override, if I can get, like, oh, wait a minute, I don't have to take this personal. This is showing me the anticipation of rejection. And so that's also in there.
Well, and it just highlights to me too the importance of not only knowing what triggers you, but also knowing, as a therapist, knowing your own attachment style as well. How do you have a secure attachment style, and are you able to actually be a secure base? Are you able to not, as you put it, take these things personally, that these behaviors personally, that the person is pushing you away? And so I love that you bring that up in the book, that, again, this is healing and treatment within the context of a relationship. And so we have to recognize the part that we are playing and the things that are coming up for us. And I also really like your use of the terms activating and deactivating. I think that just provides another point from which to understand the insecure attachment styles, and another perspective of, okay, it makes sense that if I have experienced a feeling of being dismissed or rejection, that I'm going to deactivate attachment experiences because I'm used to them not being present. And so I need to just deactivate that kind of need to have an attachment relationship with somebody. Whereas if I've had these inconsistencies, and sometimes I've had my needs met, other times I haven't, and I have this anxiety, then I'm always going to be trying to activate, like, okay, where's the relationship at? How are we doing? Are we still connected or not connected? And so constantly trying to activate that experience. So I really love the use of those terms.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because it really is like the deactivating is deactivating the attachment needs in a way so that I don't get the rejection from you as my caregiver. If I know that I can, not need so much, it helps me to stay in relationship with the person that I need with integrity for myself. The other thing, just a little thing that always is interesting to me, is this notion of anxiety, that the hyperactivating is like showing the anxiety, and the anxiety is big. And so some people say the anxious pattern or the anxious style versus the avoidant. And I always like to remember that the avoidant child is highly anxious, but downplaying it. And when they like measure cortisol through the saliva or something, there's anxiety there. And just like when we see someone shut down or turn away, the anxiety may promote that kind of defensive pattern or a dissociation. Sometimes when someone's spacing out, what happened just before you started to go away? And some anxious moment comes. But I just wanted to say that I like to hold that both avoidant and ambivalent have anxiety to them, that it's not just one is anxious and one isn't.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think that's a great point to highlight, especially for, I think about the work that I do with educators and helping them I think the term anxious is good for the layperson in terms of just trying to help them recognize that there are these differences between the ambivalent versus avoidant attachment style, because they can see it more. They can maybe recognize, okay, it looks like anxiety, so therefore they may be more in the ambivalent style. And then in avoidant, they don't see that external anxiety behavior as much. And so it's helpful in that perspective. But I do appreciate your comment that there's still anxiety there. There's still the child is still stressed, ultimately, because they haven't got that secure base to be able to have their needs met and to reduce that stress that they're experiencing, that dysregulation. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and because I've been playing with these terms, but for the book, you've moved from the term attachment style to attachment patterns. Will you tell us a little bit about the switch in those terms, and kind of what led you to that?
It was really going back into the early studies of starting with Ainsworth and Bowlby, and really looking at how they use the term pattern. Style actually came out of the adult attachment literature. So a few things that I think about, those early studies were based on observation of the child's relationship with a person. And so the pattern was dependent on the relationship. And I think that sometimes style kind of gives the impression of like, oh, a trait and a real and yeah, of a trait versus a relational process.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I think pattern really also fits because there's all these different components of the pattern, which are kind of addressed in the grids that we can address, where style just tends to be more like a manner of being, a style of being and behaving, that it just doesn't, to me, have the nitty gritty that you might figure out by now that I kind of like really drilling down into seeing like what are the detail of the components here. Because I also think people can come in and say, I have a style, or they might come in and say, I notice that these different things repeat. I have patterns that
Mm-hmm.
repeat in relationship. And I can start noticing what of these patterns are coming up with me. And then I can look at, when I lean in relationally, if someone sort of leans back and is like, you don't have to do that. I'm okay. Like, might feel patronized by my offer of help, where someone else might really be relieved by, oh, finally, there's someone here to help me. So there's these different moments that appear that I can kind of see as they're showing me something elemental about the pattern of the person's experience that I can kind of work with.
The things that are sticking out to me that you've just said, and you use the word repetition, and I think when we think about the term pattern, that then lends very, I mean, you automatically think of repetition. When you think of a word pattern, it repeats, right? So I agree with you. I think that terminology seems to be much more applicable to the healing process. If we can help people understand that we are repeating things because it's what feels comfortable because of our previous experiences, so we continue to repeat them. Whereas and then versus the style where, like you said, that's your words, it was exactly where my mind was going, is it's more of a trait, and traits are less fixable, traits are less movable. We think of them as more fixed parts of ourselves. And so I think the use of the word pattern provides some opportunity for someone to say, oh, we can change patterns. We can slot something else in and it changes the pattern, and then that changes where we go a long way from here. If we start, we may have a pattern, but when we start slotting something else in, it changes it and it goes somewhere else completely. And I think that sets the stage for healing, and knowing that we can move towards a place of security, or more security within the relationships. But another important thing that I think you said is that the pattern can be based on the relationship, the current relationship, whether that be, and I just mentioned this in a presentation yesterday, that yes, it's very, it shows up a lot in our intimate relationships, but even in work relationships. If I have a colleague who is avoidant within the work environment, that's going to change how I respond. I personally am secure dismissive, so I have that slight avoidant tendency. And so if I'm working with someone who isn't very good at following through, who doesn't really do what they say they're going to do, I'm probably going to start saying things like, you know what, I'm just going to do it. I'll do the task myself. I don't really need you to be a part of this. And so I'm avoiding being in that relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I talk to people about, we all exist on kind of this attachment continuum, or within the quadrants of attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And often we move depending on what the other person is bringing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. And I think that we see that in relationships where sometimes folks might be more avoidant in one relationship if they have someone who's quite, pursuing, but then
Mhm.
might actually enter a different relationship with someone who's more avoidant and then find themselves in that pursuing role. So there's that piece. Um, but, and as a clinician, one of the things that's, I think, most salient here is that as a clinician, I can create secure functioning, or I can create conditions that might allow for more secure functioning so that the person feels safer and feels more capable of exploring and being open with me to go to the places that were wounded or hurt. And so I think that's something that's also really important. And like, for example, I might do work with an individual and a colleague works with a couple. So the colleague might see more of the attachment behavior really playing out between the couple. And then when the person comes to me, they might appear more secure. They might appear more relaxed or in touch with themselves because they're not in that aroused state of shutting down and not being aware. And so it's a real important part of healing to be able to have places where this secure functioning can show up. I noticed that Stan Tacken is talking more about secure functioning than secure attachment. And I kind of like that because I think that when we can identify moments of security and affirm them in our patients that we're working with, we can help them get to know, like, oh, this is what security can feel like. And that can
Mhm.
transfer later.
I can't help but think about the listeners hopefully know that I do a lot of work with educators. And so as you're talking, Karen, I'm really thinking about how this shows up in the school environment. And most often I see this as when we have students who are having a challenge within the classroom, and often that conflict comes up between the teacher and the student, or the adult that's in the classroom and the student, whether it's about that relationship or not, but that's where the conflict often comes to fruition. And so the student then ends up being removed, or takes a break and goes to the social worker or the counselor. And I feel like that's kind of what you just described, with you've got clients who are in the relationship in therapy and there's a lot of conflict there. Then they come to you individually and you're that secure. They feel more secure within that relationship. And to me, that's what's happening in the school environment too, is that the social worker or counselor creates this space that allows for more of those secure feelings, that I can switch my back brain off. I can start to figure out what's really going on in this other relationship. The challenge in the school environment is, how do we bring those pieces together when we don't have very much time to do that?
Mhm.
Compared to therapy, where,
Mhm.
we do have a little more luxury of the time to come together. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Any thoughts about the issues with
Well,
time?
how can we help? I'm thinking about my educators who really want their students to be successful. And many of them are coming to the classroom with these disrupted attachment relationships.
Mhm.
And knowing that they don't have all of the time, they don't have an hour one-to-one with the student, what are some things that maybe they could do to promote that security?
I mean, one of the things that just comes to me is just being able to match the child for a moment and
Mm,
and identify if there's distress. Because sometimes with insecure attachment, part of the um, pain is not being seen and not being understood. And so if there is like one adult other who can understand, who might even be able to say, like, wow, you're really upset right now. Here, let's see if we can do something to help you, as
mhm,
opposed to don't act like that. Let's take, not saying that,
mhm,
but just that sense of, being seen can be so calming actually to
mhm,
the system. So that's just one thing that occurs to me, is just start with really mirroring, empathizing where the kid is before trying to shift behavior.
mhm. Well, and I love that because we all want solutions. And but in order to get to a place of solution, everyone needs to, like you said, feel heard. And your own personal experience, you described at the beginning of the podcast, of not feeling seen and heard and having those feelings validated when you went through something very, very difficult, was, has impacted you as you've gone through life. And so I think that is it's not always easy, but it's a definitely accessible first step for any adult with any child to say, wow, you look really upset right now. Even if we don't go any further than that, we just have shown them that I can see that you feel upset right now, even if we don't understand where that upset's coming from. I just think sometimes this work feels very hard and like I don't know what to do, but there are some fairly simple things that we can do, like you just said, helping somebody feel seen and heard.
I mean, in a way, that goes to the premise, one of the premises of AEDP is undoing aloneness. Like, I'm not alone with my suffering. Someone else gets it. And that in itself is so huge. Huge.
Well, Karen, I have loved talking to you this afternoon. I want to remind our listeners that your book, Tailoring Treatment to Attachment Patterns, is coming out on March 11th. I thoroughly recommend it and endorse it if people are interested. And you've got some wonderful advanced praise in the book as well already. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with our listeners or that is important for them to know?
I would just say that part of what I think the book really does is it takes these grids and then it drills down into the formation of each pattern and then intervention. And it has illustrated transcripts of what you can do with each pattern. So for instance, when sometimes my supervisees will come in and be like, how do I address someone who doesn't have any awareness of their emotions? And we look at, well, how can we help someone be with themselves if they haven't been accustomed to having anyone be with them? And so there's different suggestions of how to use the relational work or how to be with affect-laden words, how to have people maybe repeat the words or mirror back what's seen to kind of give them an anchor. So rather than saying something like, oh, what's happening inside? I notice without changing anything, I notice your hands pushing away. I wonder if you can just tell us what your hands might be saying right now. Or, wow, that word, disheveled just seems like such a significant word. Can you say that and just like be with what occurs to you with that? Or with someone who's speaking on a runaway train, how to get our foot in the door and say like, hey, can you slow down for a minute? Would it be okay? I want to hear everything you have to say, but I wonder if we can just slow down. I have these terms, wall of words with one pattern and wall of silence with the other, to just kind of look at what shows up. So anyway, there's just lots of nitty-gritty tidbits of what you can do with different patterns and illustrations and discussions. So I just want to listen.
I love that, because as a clinician, often it can be overwhelming, all of the knowledge and information, and as you said, having your supervisees come to you and say, well, how do I actually do this? Like, what does this sound like when I'm with a client? What are the words that I need to be using? So I love that there's, kind of ready to go tools for here's what you do if you find yourself in this situation with this client. I think that will be hugely beneficial to the clinicians out there. So wonderful, Karen. I'm so excited for our listeners to hear your conversation and to pick up the book. And I just want to thank you again for joining me on the podcast.
Well, Kirsty, thank you so much. It's just been a pleasure to talk with you. So thank you for having me.